So we're going to chat for half an hour. I'm going to open it up for you all at 3:30 for 15 minutes. Please line up here if you would kindly, and then you're welcome to ask your questions. The book we're going to be discussing, of course, is Political Order and Political Decay. And apparently it took him 3 months to write this.
A little longer.
A little longer. Dr. Fukuyama, what is this book about, and what exactly is liberal democracy?
Well, the book actually started out as an effort to think through a problem that was created for American foreign policy after September 11th. Because in Iraq and Afghanistan, you had this problem that you had this radical terrorist movement, Islamist movement, that was filling a vacuum that was basically left by a weak state. In the case of Afghanistan, it was a state that's always been weak. In the case of Iraq, it was a formerly strong state that we undermined and then left a big vacuum. And I think up until the present moment with ISIS, now this new group in Iraq and Syria that we're now battling, these movements are not inherently that powerful. They have not really shown that they can actually run a modern technological civilization. But they thrive on the fact that everybody around them is so weak. And I think that's why they've expanded into places like Africa, Mali and Cameroon and northern Nigeria, because these are all places that don't have states. They don't have states that can keep order and police and protect their own people. And American foreign policy has been wrestling with the problem, how do you build a state in a place like Afghanistan or Iraq where authority has collapsed? And I would say we still haven't figured this out. We're not very good at it.
Yes. So it's different to take power and then govern.
Yeah.
Very different skill set. So what is it that people don't quite understand about that process?
Well, so there's really three central institutions that are necessary. So one is the state itself, which is all about power. It's the ability to protect the community and deliver services. And then there's two others. The second one is law, the rule of law, which constrains the state, and it forces the state to act according to rules that the community has set. And then there's finally democracy, which is an attempt to force the state to pay attention to the wishes of the whole population. And I think in many cases, the democracy part of it has gotten ahead of the state building part, and that's been kind of our problem, because both Afghanistan and Iraq held elections, but what they couldn't do was deal with a problem like corruption. And I think actually today in the world, corruption and utter state failure is really the central problem of politics.
What about political accountability and getting everyone involved and engaged?
Well, I think that this is something that happens as societies get richer and have higher levels of education. If you have a rising middle class like you do in Brazil or in Turkey or in China, a lot of those people are going to want accountable government because they've got property, the government can take it away, and that's the condition, I think, under which democracy has spread in many parts of the world. And so it's it's a big effort to build political institutions that can actually accommodate those demands for participation.
Wonderful. So you're speaking also about the middle class. I would like to talk about the middle class and its role in democracy and why its health or disappearance is a problem for democracy.
Well, Aristotle said this, more than 2,000 years ago, that democracy works best in a society that has a broad middle class. I think middle class people, they're educated, they're aware of what the government is doing, and also they have some property. And if the government can take it away through taxation or confiscation, they're not going to, be happy about that. And so therefore, I think everywhere the middle class has always been the support for democracy. And that's why I think in China, for example, the regime is going to have a big problem, because right now there may be 300 to 400 million Chinese that can be classified as middle class. They're the ones that are, texting each other on Weibo, which is the Chinese equivalent of Twitter. They're the ones that I think want more freedom, and if democracy is ever going to come to a place like China, they're the ones that are going to push for it.
So there is a classic model under which democracy has developed in the past, and there are four main actors, correct? So it's the middle class, the working class, the landowners, and the peasants.
That's
so
right.
Can you give us an overall view of what each of these groups is interested in? So, for example, the middle class wants to protect their own property. Are they as interested in political participation and or income redistribution, that kind of thing?
Right. So, this in a way is clear in a place like Latin America. So Venezuela has been subject to this dictatorship of Hugo Chavez for the last several years, and you see the fact that poor people support him because he's in favor of redistribution, whereas in that country, most of the middle class actually want property rights because they don't want the government to arbitrarily take things away. And then there's an old landowning class that's been, in that part of the world, the bulwark of conservatism. And so, democracy is something that, so nobody wants to live under tyranny, but I think that democracy tends to come with societies that are a little bit richer, where you do have middle-class people that have property that they want the government to protect.
And so the large landowners, they do exist in the world still.
Well, they're a big problem. And this is a big problem and why democracy did not arrive for many generations in Europe in the 19th century, because in a place like Germany or France or Russia particularly, you had a big class of landowners, and that's still the problem in a place like Pakistan. I mean, Pakistan is virtually a feudal country in which peasants live under serf-like conditions in large estates, and that's the reason that democracy has never worked well in that country, because it's really controlled by a landowning elite. And I think you're not going to get successful government in Pakistan until there's really something of a social revolution there.
Interesting. So of these four, the peasantry are the ones who can become radicalized very quickly. Is that right?
Well, that's what happened in the Chinese and the Bolshevik revolutions. In Vietnam. That it turned out, Karl Marx got it wrong, because Karl Marx said that it was the industrial proletariat that would be the bearers of revolution, and then it turned out that actually those workers were doing pretty well in Europe. They were getting richer and they were actually becoming middle class, which is why there was never a communist revolution in Germany or France or in Britain. But in Russia and Vietnam and China, you did have very unequal societies, and it was the peasants that actually formed the backbone of the communist movements there.
Interesting. So are there steps that need to be followed in order to arrive at democracy? Can you put the cart before the horse?
Well, I guess it depends on who the who is.
Yes.
Because there's nobody that has this Olympian power to say, well, we're going to so for example, in East Asia, in Korea and Taiwan, you had a lot of economic growth under an authoritarian regime. And then in the 1980s, both of these countries democratized. And many people say, well, this is the best way to do it. This is what the Europeans did in the 19th century. You have economic growth, and then you only have democracy later. But the fact is, if you look around the world, most recently in Hong Kong, but in Brazil, in Turkey, in the Arab Spring, in many other countries, people aren't going to wait. They're unhappy with the quality of government. And so I think democracy, in a sense, is a popular grassroots movement that is very, very hard to repress. And so ideally, in some sense, maybe you'd want to have more economic development before you had democracy, but I think in most countries that's just not an option.
So let's do a survey. Let's look at democracies in certain parts of the world. Let's look at what's happening in India, compare that to Japan, to Tunisia and Russia. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. So those are all very, very different problems.
Yes.
In India, so just think about this example. In the late 1990s, there was an economist named John Drez who did a survey of schools in northern India, in certain northern Indian poor states. He discovered that 50% of school teachers were not showing up for work despite the fact that they were getting paid. 50%. And there's a big hue and cry. India's got a very vigorous democracy. People were outraged at this. After 10 years of reform efforts, they did another survey, and it turned out the percentage of teachers not showing up for work was exactly the same, 50%. They could not fix this problem. And so India has a free press, it's got parties that contest the government, they've got opposition. It's really a free society, but they cannot deliver these very, very basic services. And I think that's why Indians voted quite massively for Narendra Modi, the current prime minister, because they want a strong leader. They want somebody that can actually break through all of this, weakness, this state weakness, and actually get something done. Japan, on the other hand, I think is in a certain way like the United States, where it's suffering from a certain degree of political decay, that it's getting to be an old democracy. There are very powerful interest groups. One of the reasons you had the Fukushima nuclear disaster that was handled so badly was that the nuclear industry had basically captured the regulators and controlled them. And so the Japanese Nuclear Regulatory Authority couldn't really, up to this present moment, get control of that situation. And so they've got the problem that they've got, in a sense, too developed a democracy where interest groups have managed to put a hold on the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. So Russia, what an interesting case. So there was a time when Putin wasn't as strong as he is. There was a resurgence. He's come back. Is he a czar? Is he a puppet master? What's going on with
So Russia, I think, is a good example of the new world in which the big dividing line is not so much democracy versus authoritarian government, but it's really kleptocratic government versus modern government. So modern government is supposed to actually serve the public interest. The government is not there for the private enrichment of the people running the government. And in Russia, it's kind of the opposite, that Putin and all of the business cronies, the oligarchs around him, essentially want to hold on to power because they can milk resources from the state. This is oil and energy revenues and so forth. And they justify their rule on the basis of a nationalist story that they've been selling the Russian people. But the reality of that government is just an unbelievably high degree of corruption. And that's really the fight that's going on in Ukraine, because these young protesters in Kiev earlier this year wanted to get rid of the Ukrainian version of Mr. Putin, who was this fellow Viktor Yanukovych, who was an extremely corrupt, I don't know if you saw the pictures of this, but he was building a palace for himself outside of Kiev that was like 6 times the size of the White House, and funneling billions of dollars out of Ukraine for the benefit of his own family. And that's really the big dividing line in the world, I think, is really between these highly corrupt governments and governments that actually try to be modern in the sense of being impersonal.
Now, Ukraine had an opportunity there, right, to move towards reform. What happened? Why did they drop the ball?
Well, in 2004, you had this, what was called the Orange Revolution, in which you had young protesters that took over Maidan Square, forced a new election that pushed this Viktor Yanukovych out. The new government that took power, the democratically elected government, failed to deal with the problem of corruption. They were bickering, they themselves were very corrupt, and as a result, in 2010, Yanukovych was voted back in a free and fair election. And this is why I think the big struggle is really, in a sense, for many countries, not over democracy. There is democracy in Ukraine and in Russia. The big struggle is over whether you can have a clean government, a government that actually tries to serve the public interest.
So speaking about that, let's look at Egypt before we look at Tunisia, because Egypt had a wonderful opportunity. They thought they had an opportunity. They didn't realize that the military just went into tactical retreat. They were regrouping, and they came right back. And what has happened since?
Well, Egypt is a really terrible tragedy, because prior to the Arab Spring, a lot of people thought that the Arabs were just somehow passive. They didn't care about democracy. They're happy to live under an authoritarian government. And I think the one thing that the Arab Spring showed is that that's just not true, that there's no cultural reason why Arabs like to live under a tyrannical government any more than anyone else. But the big problem was when they had this opening, after Mubarak stepped down, or the army forced him to step down, they didn't know how to convert that energy and anger into organization and into institutions. And there was an organization in Egypt that knew how to do this, which was the Muslim Brotherhood, this Islamist group. They won the first parliamentary and presidential elections, and that gave the army an excuse to come back into power again.
Very interesting. Do you think there's hope for Egypt?
Not in the short run. I think the army is in there with, I hate to say, but with a certain amount of American support. And I think it's going to be, probably another generation until there's another effort to open up that system again.
So America likes authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. They're more stable, right?
Well, America has always had these interests in fighting terrorism and in securing oil supply. We've got a big opportunity right now because thanks to Texas and other North Dakota and places like that, the United States is about to become an exporter of liquefied natural gas, which is going to directly undercut people like Vladimir Putin. His ability to threaten, essentially blackmail Ukraine and Western Europe with his natural gas, I think that ability is going to end over the next 5 years as America ramps up, to actually export gas to the rest of the world. We've been driving down oil prices because of new technologies. American innovation is really going pretty strong, and that's going to change the balance of power in the Middle East because for the first time, we're going to be largely oil independent within a couple of years, and that is going to change our calculation about our interest in that part of the world.
Tunisia is doing relatively okay compared to everyone else in the region.
Tunisia was always the best educated country in the Middle East. It's small, which is a big advantage. It has a big middle class, and it's going to be, I think, the one success story in that entire region where you actually do get to a reasonably successful democracy within a few years. And by the way, I think that people misunderstand what's gone on in that region. They say, well, there's no democracies here 3 years after the Arab Spring. That shows it's a big failure. I have a chapter in my new book about Europe. In the year 1848, it was very much like the Arab Spring. You had revolutions in every single continental European country within the space of 2 or 3 months, and within a year they were all reversed. There was a big authoritarian comeback, and it was 100 years until Europe actually became democratic. So I think that the expectation that you can democratize in countries with no prior experience with democracy that quickly it's just it's a very naive expectation.
Do you think it was naive for America to go into the Middle East, into the two conflicts that it get engaged in to bring democracy, thinking that if we get rid of Saddam Hussein, democracy will naturally bloom?
Well, the two are different. So Afghanistan, we were perfectly justified in invading in 2001 because we had to get rid of Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. The mistake there, I think, was just staying too long, expanding that war beyond the original. Once al-Qaeda was gone, continuing the war. Iraq, I think, was a mistake from beginning to end because I think the cost of that in terms of American prestige, in terms of people killed, in terms of Iraqis killed, and in terms of the mess that exists right now, I think, in the history books is going to go down as probably one of the biggest debacles in American foreign policy.
China. China is very interesting because it became a state long before states in Europe, yet when it comes to democracy, what's happening?
Well, China, I think people don't understand. They invented the modern state, and they did this 2,300 years ago in the Qin dynasty in the 3rd century BC. They had a centralized, bureaucratic, meritocratic country. The only thing that they didn't have was either rule of law or democracy. And so they basically invented dictatorship. I mean, that's the simplest way to put it. And that's been the kind of characteristic of Chinese rule ever since. And I think that what's different about China now from this long tradition is that middle class. It's the fact that their society has undergone changes of the sort that the United States or Europe went through over a 100-year period from the mid-1900s to the middle of the 20th century, and they've done this in a generation. This much social change is going to have political implications. There's just no way that centralized, rigid system is going to be able to adapt to that kind of a social upheaval. And that's why I think the system is either going to adapt or it's going to explode.
How would you compare, let's look at South America very quickly before we look at America. How would you compare Brazil and Chile? What's happening there?
Well, Chile is a really successful country. It went through a dictatorship in the 1970s and 80s, but since then it's adopted a very open market economy, and it's basically become, it's at the poor end, but it's basically a developed country now. Brazil, the problem, again, it's not democracy, because Brazil, they're about to have a second round of their presidential election next week. It's a very vigorous, open society, but it is very, very corrupt. It is very corrupt. It is very hard to find a Brazilian legislator that does not, have a, pretty shady record. And I think part of the big struggle in that country is, can you actually get past that corruption to deliver something like bus service or health care, education? I mean, one of the reasons there's such a high level of poverty in Brazil is that their public education system is just atrocious. And so that's the sense in which I think you just need a government that can deliver things that people really want. And that's the struggle. It's less the struggle over democracy right now.
Wonderful. So let's turn our attention for the next 10 minutes to America. So you are saying some hard things about America, Dr. Fukuyama. You're saying that America is now beginning to experience decay as a democracy. And you say there are two reasons: growing economic inequality, concentration of wealth by the elites, which has allowed them to purchase immense political power and manipulate the system to further their own interest, and undue influence of interest groups.
I think that all of those things are true, and they become more problematic because of our fundamental institutional setup that the Founding Fathers created. The Founding Fathers created a system of checks and balances because they were worried about one thing above all, which was maximizing individual freedom and preventing tyranny. They really feared and distrusted centralized government, and with good reason. That's why the colonists fought a revolution against the British monarchy. But in so doing, they divided power into a system of checks and balances that has many, many more what political scientists call veto points, where a small, well-organized group can stop a decision of the whole in order to protect their interests. Now, for most of the 20th century, that system worked pretty well because the two political parties overlapped very substantially, so presidents were able to do things like Roosevelt or Johnson or Ronald Reagan. But today, because of polarization, there's no overlap between the parties. This wouldn't be that bad a thing in a parliamentary system, but in our presidential system, it basically means that every well-organized group can use that check and balance system to stop things they don't like. And so that's why we've got a tax code that I think is an embarrassment to the country. It's full of basically privileges. I mean, you've got, there's a fundamental difference between a privilege and a liberty. A liberty is a freedom from the government that applies to everybody. A privilege is something that applies to just me, my family, maybe my corporation. And, we've got a very high corporate tax rate, but very few corporations pay this because they've negotiated through their lobbyist exemptions for themselves. And the result is, something that is not representative and it's not fundamentally fair. And then you've got a Congress that has not been able to pass a budget really since 2008. And all of this, I think, very simple things, immigration reform or the mildest forms of gun control, where you get very strong popular majorities in the country that say they want this. Congress can't pass it because any well-organized interest group can veto actions by the whole, and I think that's where we're stuck. So that's why I call the situation that we have vetocracy, meaning rule by veto.
So the vicious cycle that's created, let's talk about that, because you said that American state deals poorly with major challenges because?
Well, okay, to be fair, the United States in some dimensions actually is fairly effective. So, for example, the Federal Reserve Board and, to be fair, the U.S. Congress actually dealt, I think, with the financial crisis reasonably well, much better than the Europeans did, because a lot of power is delegated to certain institutions like the Treasury and the Fed that actually allow it to act in an emergency. I think despite the fear over Ebola, actually in the end our public health system is going to, they've made some mistakes in the last couple of weeks, but it's going to hold up, and I think it's going to demonstrate to people why you actually need a strong, effective government. And so there are parts of the U.S. that actually work pretty well. I think in foreign policy, we've still got a pretty strong ability to make decisions, and although Americans are not eager to leap into another war, we still can exercise power globally much more effectively than the Europeans or other powers. The big problems, I think, come in dealing with long-term problems, things that are not immediate crises, things like looking forward in terms of budget deficits, in terms of doing things like long-term entitlement reform. These are things that I think are going to be really beyond the capacity of the American political system.
Now, you wrote one of the most famous books in political science 25 years ago, is that right?
Well,
about that.
You said that, I didn't.
I remember reading it. It was just remarkable. It was called End of History. What was the thesis of that book? And now looking back at it, where are you? Do you still believe it? Because you were associated with the neoconservative movement. What was that movement and what was the book?
Well, the book was not, I would say, a neoconservative book. No, the book was actually written in this tradition of Hegel and Marx in European philosophy. And the history that I was talking about was history with a capital H. That is to say, the evolution of human societies as they go from hunter-gatherer to agricultural to industrial to post-industrial. And the question of the end of history is not the termination of history, it's the question of where is history pointing. And so for many years, progressive intellectuals said it's pointing towards communism. That was Marx's view. Marx believed that history would end in a communist utopia, and all I did was get up and say in 1989, we're not going to get there. We're not headed towards communism. It looks like we're headed, if anything, towards liberal democracy, and I think that's still true. I think the only reasonable alternative model out there that is a real challenge is the China model. But for a whole variety of reasons, I don't think that that's a sustainable either economic or political system. So I still basically believe that the foundations of that theory are true.
Why isn't China sustainable, economically or politically?
Well, I think first of all they privilege growth over other things like environment, clean air, clean soil, water. This sort of thing, to such an extent that they've got many liabilities built into that system. But the bigger problem is political. They've got essentially a very strong state with no rule of law and no democratic accountability. It's an unchecked dictatorship, and that system can work well as long as they've got a good emperor in place. If you've got a good emperor, then they can do things quickly like build high-speed rail and internet connectivity and so forth. But if they get a bad emperor, there are no checks and balances, and therefore no way to stop this person. And right now you've got a leader in China, Xi Jinping, who is conducting basically a purge on the grounds of anti-corruption, who may be one of the most powerful leaders in China since Mao Zedong. And we don't know whether he's a good emperor or a bad emperor at the present moment.
One last question before we open it up. Please, if you have questions, feel free to start lining up. Globalization and technological change in a capitalist economy. What does that look like, and what is America's response, do you think?
I think that democracy is fundamentally challenged by technological change, because the whole impact of the information technology revolution, automation, robots, all of these things, has been to erode middle-class employment. Machines can substitute, smart machines can substitute for more and more different kinds of human labor. And so the result is that the median income in this country is 8% lower today than it was in 2007 prior to the financial crisis. And this is a problem. It affects all countries. In Europe, because they've got a bigger welfare state, they can mask the effect, but they're still suffering from that same erosion of jobs. And as Aristotle said, if you don't have a broad middle class, I think it's very hard to sustain a democracy. And I think that's the central political and economic challenge that any government in the United States is going to have to face going forward.
Wonderful. Yes, please.
Probably a question towards the last point. Europe, why, even though having democracy, most of the Western Europe, why was it unable to get out of the financial crisis and the impact of it quick enough to matter?
Okay, so why was Europe not able to deal with the crisis effectively? On a national level, I think there are many actually pretty effective democracies in Europe. Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, they've all done pretty well. The big problem is in the design of the European Union. And quite frankly, the problem is that the European Union looks a lot like the United States increasingly. It's a federal system with very complex divided powers, but they allocate the powers in the wrong way. So they make Brussels really powerful where it shouldn't be. So, you know, on the labeling of food and cheese and wine and this sort of thing, Brussels is always telling people they can't do things they'd like to do, and it's very annoying. But on things that where it really counts, like monetary policy or fiscal policy, they're extremely weak. They don't have the power that the Fed does or the U.S. Congress does. And that's what really led to the euro crisis in 2010. And believe me, they're not out of it yet. They're in no way out of it.
Thank you.
Your description about what's going on in the United States was quite clear and is pretty much the way I see it, too. What do you think is going to happen?
Crystal ball, yes.
Well, I guess I have to say that at the moment I'm kind of pessimistic, because it seems to me that after the financial crisis, given that it originated on Wall Street, you should have seen a big populist upsurge that would lead to a mobilization that would then lead to, for example, adequate financial regulation that would solve the original problem, and that hasn't happened. And in fact, you know, the only big mobilization we've seen since the crisis has actually been on the right with the Tea Party. It's, you know, politically it's very strange, and I don't think that there's been adequate leadership where, you know, you've had a progressive coalition where there's a leader that can adequately explain what happened and, you know, point to a way forward, particularly when dealing with this technological challenge that I mentioned. And therefore, I think, you know, we're stuck where we are. And so I unfortunately think that the only way we're going to get out of this is by some big external shock. You know, if the dollar collapses or there's another big banking crisis or a war or something that will kind of shock us out of our complacency. I hate to say this because, you know, I'm not looking forward to this, but I think that's the way political change oftentimes has to come about.
Kind of on an adjacent note, what do you feel the role is of a well-informed electorate in a modern democracy, and what role could that have in actually shaping the types of mobilizations that you're talking about both here and in restructuring places like China?
Well, so look, a well-educated and well-informed electorate is absolutely critical for the functioning of a democracy. There's no question about it, and Americans don't pay attention. You know, we don't teach civics in schools anymore. Students don't understand the basic structure of the American government or the American Constitution. They get, you know, very poor information given to them on television and, you know, highly opinionated bloviators on the internet, but very little real information. And so it's possible in this country to believe really absurd things for a very long period of time. And so I think that that is an extremely important dimension of citizenship. I mean, citizenship has not been emphasized in this country for a very long time. The fact that all of us have a duty as citizens to keep informed and to participate and to vote and to, you know, basically care about the public sphere. There's been this denigration of public affairs, I think, for the last generation that I think has been very destructive.
Thank you. Yes.
I really appreciated the comments that you made on privileges versus liberties. I thought that really described the difference between kind of what you see for a special interest group versus that's good for something that's good for all. And I wanted to ask you, from a historical perspective, how does a country get out of that sort of decay or decline? Are there examples of countries or civilizations that have gotten out of it, of where the democracy gets to the point where it is more or less controlled by extremely powerful interest groups, to the point almost where I would say it's not that we haven't been able to get anything done for the past 5 years, although that's been awful, but it's the only things we have gotten done have been for special interest groups.
Right.
So I wanted you to expound a little bit on this concept from a historical perspective, if you could.
Well, this is great. So I get to tell you a little historical story. So in the old regime in France, before the French Revolution, the degree of corruption and privileges got to the following extent that the French king, Louis XIII, Louis XIV, they're so broke all the time because of all the wars that they constantly fought, that they actually would sell government offices to rich individuals. So you could buy the position of treasurer of France for a big sum of money, and then after that you could collect taxes and you could keep all of the taxes for yourself. And not only that, you could take this office and you could give it to your children as part of their inheritance. This was called venal office holding, and so the adjective venal comes from this French practice. How did the French do it? How did they fix this system? They tried to reform it several times in the 18th century, and ultimately they had to have a revolution, and they basically beheaded all of the people that had these venal offices, and that was the, that was the solution.
A little extreme, Dr. Fukuyama.
A little bit extreme.
It's a bit extreme.
In the second, so that story is in the first volume of this Political Order series. The more positive example, I think, is the one I tell about the progressive era in the United States. In the progressive era, so in the 19th century, the United States had this thing that's historically known as the spoils system or the patronage system, in which every single office from the federal government all the way down to your local postmaster was allocated on the basis of political patronage. It was given to somebody as a reward for political support by a member of Congress or a representative or whatnot. This system was ended beginning in the 1880s as a result of a grassroots movement where grandmothers would get very upset that their fourth-class postmaster was some political hack. It was combined with good leadership from people like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, and then it was stimulated by an external shock, which was the assassination of James Garfield in 1882 at the hands of a would-be office seeker that finally embarrassed Congress into passing something known as the Pendleton Act in 1883, which set up the first U.S. Civil Service Commission, basically said, we're not giving out offices politically, it's going to be done on the basis of a merit-based civil service exam, and so forth. And so that's an example of democracy fixing itself.
Right before we started Facebook that I was here and listened to you, I was very excited, and a friend of mine immediately commented, "Oh, you're not going to like his neocon style." and what was ironic was right when he commented on that, you were saying Iraq was the biggest mistake from beginning to end. So I wrote back, well, I don't think he's a neocon, he just said this, and then he wrote back something about how you signed something saying Saddam had to go. So then I put my phone away because I wanted to listen to you. But so where do you stand in relation to the neocon movement, and what do you have to say about that movement in general?
Not to put you on the spot.
Well,
there's a microphone here.
It's an easy question to answer because I actually wrote a whole book about this called America at the Crossroads, Democracy, Power, and the Neoconservative Legacy, and it's about why I broke with them. Because I think that they made a fundamental mistake, which is the overestimation of what hard American military power could do to reshape the politics of the Middle East. They were way too optimistic about this. And I think that's been borne out by events in both Iraq and Afghanistan, where we were trying to create prosperous, stable democracies, and we really failed, I think, despite huge investments of manpower and wealth in both of those countries. And so I think that we need a more modest foreign policy. That's not a foreign policy of complete disengagement. So I think that, you know, we still need to influence the way things work, and we need to deal with threats and so forth. But I think the lesson from those two wars is that American power cannot concretely shape an outcome on the ground in that part of the world. And we should stop, you know, kidding ourselves that we can do that. So even with so I think that I support airstrikes against ISIS in Iraq and Syria right now, but I think that the objective of destroying ISIS was too ambitious. I don't think we're going to do it. We haven't destroyed Al-Qaeda in 13 years of trying. And again, I think, you know, President Obama went from, I think, excessive passivity to once again kind of over-promising, you know, what American power could deliver.
So you can write to your friend, neocon no more.
Right. I would like to know what is your stand on the vulture funds in Argentina, specifically on the ruling of the New York court against the country whether it's led into default if it pays or if it doesn't.
I'm sorry, about Argentina?
Yeah, and the vulture funds and the ruling that the country's being led to default whether it pays or doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, this New York judge, his ruling on these the holdouts and the bond thing is a very narrow question. And as you know, I'm not an expert in bankruptcy law. I think it's a somewhat questionable ruling, but that's not the big issue in Argentina. I mean, the big issue in Argentina is just long-term, pervasive, bad macroeconomic policy. Argentina is a classic case of a country that does not learn from history. It did not learn from, you know, the many hyperinflations that it has experienced over the years. It always gives in to these populist political passions where, so under the Kirchners, the most recent presidents, you know, the Argentine government spent much more money than it could take in. It couldn't borrow money on international markets, so it started printing money. The vice president actually bought the company that was printing the currency so that he could, you know, benefit from it. And then when the statistical agency said this is going to lead to inflation, or this is leading to inflation, they sacked everybody in the agency and put their own people there. So, you know, talk about bad government. I mean, Argentina has been a poster child for, you know, for bad government for many, many years. And so, you know, the judge may be wrong in this particular case. I mean, in this one, I think I'm maybe side with the Argentine government, you know, a little bit more. But that's not the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is just a government that really does not know how to run an economy.
Let's take one more quick question.
Hi. For American citizens, beyond what you already spoke to about becoming informed and staying informed, what are your ideas about our abilities or our responsibilities in how the government is now and trying to change it back to where the people have more power instead of corporations? And also on where you become and stay informed, that it's not slanted to one side or the other.
Well, we got a really big problem in dealing with money and politics. You know, I think that is ultimately at the root of many of our problems. This effort of elites to grab the political system and use it for their own purposes is really fueled by money, and the Supreme Court has said that money in politics is basically a form of free speech and therefore protected by the First Amendment. I think this is, you know, a very strange decision. I think many other democracies are able to control money. So, you know, money is important in any democratic system, but other democracies are actually able to control the amount of money much better than we are. So it's not impossible to do. Given that the court has spoken this way, we're kind of stuck, and this is, again, one of the reasons why our system is so hard to reform, because you either have to get a new court or you got to get a constitutional amendment, which isn't going to happen, I suspect, in my lifetime. So I think what it depends on is citizen mobilization. You know, that's the way democracies are going to, that's the way they work. people get mad about something, they mobilize, they organize, they come up with a plan, a concrete plan that is going to fix things, and then they push for it using the political system. That's the story of the progressive era, and that's a story that could have unfolded after the financial crisis, but has not. So I think that's the task, in front of everybody today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Order and Political Decay. We would love for you to be mobilized in that direction. Go to the book signing tent, please, and meet Dr. Fukuyama. Get a copy of his book. Thank you for being here.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
That was great.
That was Francis Fukuyama talking about his book Political Order and Political Decay. Mr. Fukuyama was a guest on Book TV's 3-hour in-depth program in 2006. You can watch that on our website, booktv.org. Another in-depth guest, Katha Pollitt, will be coming up next. She'll be talking about her book Pro, Reclaiming Abortion Rights. Book TV's live coverage from the Texas Book Festival continues after this short break.